Thank you, Mr Deputy President. And I rise to continue remarks that were interrupted by question time earlier today. But to recap, in simple terms, a few years ago, Labor Party made a decision to the Labor government, and then Labor government made a decision to take money away from people, and this bill here before the chamber today returns that money to people and returns us to the default position that people can expect that they will not have money taken from their bank account before it is inactive for a period of 7 years. As I went over in my earlier remarks, that had been the record and the policy of the Commonwealth Government from 1911 through to 2012. Over that period, it was always the case that you had 7 years before money would be unclaimed monies would be claimed by the government. A couple of years ago, the then Labor government, in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to reach a budget target, decided to reach into the piggy banks of every Australian household and take that money off them earlier and change that policy of 101 years, and this bill helps change that back. It was a policy for 101 years, almost the entire period of the Australian or Commonwealth government, a time through which we had 2 world wars, a Great Depression, a Cold War, 2 Olympic Games, I think, were hosted in Australia over that period. It was a consistent policy over that entire time frame. But then suddenly the world's greatest treasurer, the world's greatest finance minister, a few years ago thought, no, this is wrong. It may have been the policy for more than 100 years, but I think this is wrong, and we should take that money back from people after 3 years, not 7. Well, unfortunately, I think the world's greatest treasurer got that wrong 2 years ago, and the government now has got it right in returning our position back to the default that people can expect to have their money in the bank for at least 7 years before it's deemed to be unclaimed monies and taken by the government. And the scope of the change was quite significant. It wasn't simply just an administrative change going from 7 to 3 years. There was a substantial amount of money put at risk by this change. In 2013, the year after the decision was made, there were $550 million in unclaimed money was taken by the federal government. That was the year after Mr Swan, as Treasurer, changed the law that had existed for 101 years. Whereas in 2012, the year before that change, it was only $70 million in unclaimed money. So it went from $70 million or so a year to $550 million in 1 year. You could see why the Labor Party saw this as a juicy target. They were struggling to keep any kind of control over the budget, and certainly keeping any kind of consistency in the promises they were making to people to balance the budget at the time. So they saw a $500-odd million, $500 million sitting in bank accounts out there, that people expected was their money, and they took that money. That's literally what they did. They took that $500 million, or $480 million to be precise, additional to what would normally be claimed, and transferred it to the government to help them build their bottom line. What kind of government does that overnight? I mean, even if you thought that 7 years was too long and it should be 3 or it should be 4 or 5, you'd think you'd take a little longer. You'd think you wouldn't just make that change overnight within a year and suddenly go from taking $70 million or so a year in unclaimed monies to $550 million. But it was certainly not out of step with the aptitude and approach of the Rudd-Gillard government, and unfortunately a lot of the time that this government has had to spend has been to fix up the mistakes and missteps of this former government, and this is another one that's being changed. This bill will reverse that policy. It will reverse the policy of taking people's monies after 3 years and go back to the previous situation to 7 years. Now, as I said before, the Labor Party were caught red-handed in this particular spree, this particular wild spending spree, smashing the piggy banks of people all around the country. They were caught red-handed at that, and they've now fessed up to that. They've fessed up to it because they're going to support, my understanding is, this bill, which is great, and I compliment them for that. But the best thing to do when you have done something wrong. In my life, I've certainly done many wrong things. The best thing to do once you realise it is to admit it and make amends for it. And it's good to see now that the Labor Party are finally making amends for it. But there is, I suppose, some silver lining as well to what happened a few years ago. Perhaps it's a case of no bad deed going unrewarded, because this bill now makes improvements, I believe, in regards to the policies of unclaimed monies. As I said, it's been consistent for a long time to claim those monies after a 7-year period, but this bill will extend some exemptions to certain accounts, such that the monies in those accounts won't be claimed by the government even after 7 years, and I think that's a positive development. So, for example, the funds in children's accounts will be exempted from the Unclaimed Money Bill legislation, and of course many Australians seek to put their savings or some savings into a child's accounts for their future and put it in for their trust. And of course sometimes activities in those accounts may be understandably low and may not receive any additional funds, or indeed have any activity performed on it for a period of 7 years or more, notwithstanding the fact that the parents or guardians would still expect that money to be available for the child once they turn 18 or become responsible for their own financial affairs. So in recognition of that fact, the government has made a decision not to punish parents or other Australians who have not realised that there is this 7-year period, and so children's accounts will be exempted by this bill, and I think that's a very positive change. Similarly, bank accounts denominated in foreign currency will also be exempted, and this is to reflect the fact that foreign currency accounts are usually used by sophisticated consumers to settle complex international business transactions. There is only a small number of these in the country, and it's, in our view, in the government's view, an unnecessary and unreasonable impost of red tape to expose those accounts to this particular legislative framework. So they will be exempted as well. A number of other changes will also improve the operation of the Unclaimed Money Bill's legislation. The government has made a decision to no longer publish ASIC's Unclaimed Money Gazette, which, while there have been some concerns that this may make it harder for people to reclaim their unclaimed monies, ASIC already provides an online resource for reuniting account holders with their accounts called Money Smart. And for anyone listening who may feel they have unclaimed monies, you can go to www.moneysmart.gov.au to try and find that. This particular change, in conjunction with stricter controls on access to information about unclaimed monies, will help to protect Australians with unclaimed accounts from exploitation, and that's, in my view, another positive change from this particular piece of legislation, this particular bill. This bill implements a number of privacy protections, secrecy provisions in these laws to limit the access to this information to people who truly need it. At the moment, a Freedom of Information request to ASIC can result in the personal information of Australians with an unclaimed account to be published, and that information can include the account holder's name, their last known address and the amount of money unclaimed. The Australian Information Commissioner has raised concerns that this level of information could enable identity theft, and indeed apparently there are reports that some unscrupulous businesses are using such information to charge fees as high as 25% to reunite people with their own money. The government believes that behaviour should not be accepted, or at least should not be encouraged and supported through the provision of information to people who don't own the account, and this bill will ensure that FOI requests in the future in regards to unclaimed monies will only reveal details to the individual whose account it is. So to receive these details in the future through an FOI request, the actual individual who owns the account will have had to make that request, and that change will help ensure that people's private details do indeed remain private. The government will also ensure that it is easier to keep accounts active by making it easier for people to demonstrate or qualify for an active account, so the account is not unclaimed. All they will need to do in the future is check their account online or indeed over the phone for an account balance. That simple check will trigger that the account remains active and not be subject to the unclaimed monies legislation. Combined, I believe these changes will make the framework that has existed for over a century stronger. It will make it more responsive to the particular uses that Australian consumers make of their bank accounts, particularly by exempting children's savings accounts. And while it is unfortunate the former Labor government decided to change the more than a century framework in this field, I believe we now, when this bill passes, will have a stronger unclaimed monies framework, and one that is more responsive to consumers' needs. It's also the case that this change will help reduce regulatory burden on the sector. Having to claim money on a 3-year time limit rather than a 7-year time limit may raise more money for the government, but it does impose a burden on the financial sector. This, going back to the previous regime, will help remove that burden, and it's estimated that that will save the wider economy of $36 million a year. Of course, that includes not just the burden placed on banks and life insurers who have to transfer this money to the government, but also to Australians themselves, who will no longer, or less frequently at least, have to check and try and track down the monies that may be unclaimed. And if I can say that that saving of red tape and reduced regulatory burden is a core commitment and a core value of this government. We should be a government that seeks to walk softly for business. We have a need for regulation in many areas, and this indeed is an example of where there is a need for some form of regulation, but we should seek to minimise its impost on businesses, particularly small businesses, and of course we should seek to ensure that regulation does not unduly restrict the development of our economy, the creation of jobs, and the creation of a more wealthy and prosperous community. And the government, this is just one small element of the government's regulatory reduction agenda. We have made it easier for large projects to be approved in this country. Indeed, there's been more than $700 million worth of projects approved since this government came to power. We have reduced regulation in the farm sector, particularly around the approval of chemicals and pesticides, which is becoming increasingly burdensome for that sector. These changes added up make a big difference, and the government now is also progressing further reforms to make it easier to get projects across the line, like the Adani coal mine in central Queensland, near where I live, which has the potential to deliver 10,000 jobs to central Queensland, which is it's half the size of the NBN in terms of value just in central Queensland. It's something we need to do. We should have done years ago. It's taken us 5 years to say yes or no. We need to reduce that regulatory burden and make it easier for people to invest in our country.